Right. Welcome back to Philosophy 110, Human Nature. Today, we are going to talk about Simone de Beauvoir on the subjection of women. So a quick background, Beauvoir was born in Paris, France, and she was born into a pretty well-off family. And she was, in a sense, raised with two differing moral systems as a child. Her mother was known to be a pretty devout Catholic who tried to instill Catholic teachings onto the young Beauvoir, um, while her father was actually a pretty liberal person who encouraged Beauvoir to pursue an intellectual career, which at the time was dominated by men. Um, and in fact, during childhood, Beauvoir at one point contemplated becoming a nun, which is funny to think about considering that Beauvoir, in many ways, is probably the most important figure in feminist philosophy, and challenged a lot of the sort of teachings of the church regarding traditional gender roles. Um, Beauvoir was educated at École Normale Supérieure, which is a prestigious public university in France. And at École Normale Supérieure, Beauvoir met Jean-Paul Sartre, who we talked about a couple lectures ago. And as we mentioned in that lecture, Beauvoir and Sartre would become lifelong partners and intellectual interlocutors. Um, However, Sartre and Beauvoir had a interesting and rocky relationship, to put it mildly. And even though they were partners for each of their respective entirety of each of their respective lives, they had a very unconventional, open relationship. Um, so even though they were committed to each other, they weren't monogamous. And like Sartre, Beauvoir was deeply influenced by the neo-Hegelian philosophy that was at the École Normale Supérieure, and she attended the lectures of Alexander Kojève and Jean Hippolyte, who were probably the two top philosophers in France at that time. Um, Beauvoir was also peripherally involved in the French resistance during World War II, where she would also publish pamphlets and articles critiquing the German occupation. And during the Cold War, like Sartre, Beauvoir became committed to Marxism and supported anti-colonial revolutions around the world. And in the second sex, if you read it all the way, you can clearly see a lot of Marxist or Marxian influence within Beauvoir's philosophy. Um, but perhaps more notably, Beauvoir is regarded as laying the foundations for what we would now call second wave feminism, which we'll get into here in a second. And Beauvoir was also a very important figure within 20th century existentialist philosophy. Um, and and even though she was primarily an existentialist, she used a variety of philosophical frameworks, including Marxism, Hegelianism, and psychoanalysis. So she was a very well-read, well-rounded person who pulled from a variety of different philosophical traditions to approach the question of the subordination of women. Some of her notable works include She Came to Stay, The Second Sex, The Mandarins, and The Ethics of Ambiguity. So second wave feminism, what is second wave feminism? It was part of the broader counterculture movement that took storm during the 1960s at the global scale. Second wave feminism was built on what we call first wave feminism. And first wave feminism was the feminist movement that defined the late 19th and early 20th century. First wave feminists tended to focus on the legal and political constraints that reproduced produce gender and sexual inequality for women. So first wave feminists advocated for things like suffrage or the right to vote, also basic things that we perhaps take for granted today, like having independent bank accounts or the right to divorce. And again, these things you might take for granted today, but at the time, women didn't have those liberties that people do have today, which meant that when women would get, married, presumably if they were to be married, their entire life and livelihood was at the mercy of their husbands. And second wave feminism, the foundations for second wave feminism was laid during the First World War II. So especially the United States, many men went off to go to fight the war. They went to Europe and the Pacific, and that left a an opening within many factories throughout the country, and women would leave the domestic sphere and work within these factories, producing weapons and machinery for the war efforts. Um, in the United States, at least, women were able to experience this level of freedom that they wouldn't be able to have within the domestic sphere. Um, but immediately following World War II was the 1950s, and there was a concerted effort in the United States to, quote unquote, re-domesticize women after the war. So, women were given these liberties during World War II, and then men felt threatened by that. So they tried to reinstill traditional gender roles into women. So I'm sure y'all have seen those very sexist advertisements or commercials from the 1950s, where women are encouraged to, be stay-at-home moms, or encouraged to be child bearers, or encouraged to, take on these reproductive tasks like cleaning. And they were discouraged from participating in the regular workforce. At the same time, you started to see the baby boom. So women were expected to bear and raise children, especially after the war. Um, and Especially in the West, many women looked at how women tended to be treated in the Soviet Union, where in the Soviet Union and other communist states, women did tend to enjoy a higher level of equality or rights compared to the capitalist West. So that kind of exposure together fomented into second wave feminism. And Second wave feminism, although it did focus on the political, legal constraints that women were subjected to, like the first wave feminists were, they also focused on the broader culture of patriarchy and women's subordination. And specifically, they focused on fighting the oppressive norms and the violence which women were subjected to, especially within the domestic sphere. So things like domestic violence, sexual violence, restrictive sexual norms, as well as the denial of reproductive rights, like abortion or birth control, or all these things. And because the second wave feminism emerged in the 1960s, it sought allies in other areas of struggle. So the 1960s was a huge storm of various social movements across racial, class, sexuality, and national lines. And women women in the second wave feminist movement sought to find allies within these struggles as well. Yet at the same time, second wave feminists insisted on the importance of carving out an independent space for women to organize. And during the 60s, again, the second wave feminist movement sought to challenge the traditional gender norms which they were expected to practice. Right. So we talk mostly about second wave feminism in the context of the United States. But Beauvoir obviously was writing in the context of France, which was similar, yet also different from how women were treated in the United States. But Beauvoir's book, The Second Sex, was written, 1949, so that's 4 years after the end of World War II. And in The Second Sex, Beauvoir wants to explore the nature of womanhood and the treatment of women within society, specifically using an existentialist perspective. But along with an existentialist perspective, Beauvoir also utilizes, Hegelian philosophy, Marxist philosophy, as well as psychoanalysis. So she pulls from different philosophical frameworks to try to approach to grapple with this question of what it means to be a woman. And Just a quick, fun, maybe not so fun fact: when the Second Sex first came out, it actually was banned in the Vatican City because it was contrary to church teachings at the time. Which is ironic because, again, remember, Beauvoir was raised in a devout Catholic family and considered being a nun at one point in her life. So to put it succinctly, the main question, again, the Second Sex is trying to approach is, as she writes in the introduction, what is a woman? And in the introduction, she goes over three possible frameworks or explanations of how to answer this. So the first is what we call the Platonic explanation. So Plato was an ancient Greek philosopher who thought that everything in, to put it, to simplify things very dramatically, everything in the world had a perfect essential form within the realm of forms, right? And everything in the world is just a cheap copy of its perfect form. And translating that into gender dynamics, the Platonic explanation maintains that women are defined by what we would call like a feminine essence, right? And by the same token, men are defined by a quote unquote masculine essence. Based on the femininity or the so-called femininity of women, that aspect of what they are, that essence defines their gender role in society. So this was the kind of explanation that was maybe more famous in the pre-modern period within the church or even within ancient societies. But for Beauvoir, obviously, this is a very vague description that clearly serves to justify hierarchy. And also concepts like femininity and masculinity is vague, especially when you use it in the spiritual sense, in which the Platonic explanation means to, right? But in the modern era, explanations for womanhood tend to be a little bit more precise. And certainly during Beauvoir's time, the most predominant explanation was the biological explanation, right? And according to this framework, women are defined primarily by their sexual or reproductive organs, and their gender roles based off of that fact. But for Beauvoir, she thought that this was a problematic explanation too, because this framework equivocates womanhood with the sexual organs, with reproductive organs. And obviously that serves to naturalize and justify the subordination of women. So just the fact that some people have, sexual organs that are more conducive to child rearing and giving birth, that doesn't automatically mean that those people should be constrained within a certain station in society, right? And obviously this, in many ways, resembles contemporary transfeminist critiques of like cisgenderism. Beauvoir slightly outdates those critiques, but you can certainly see the influence of that here. And finally, we have the situational explanation. This is the one that Beauvoir advocates. According to this model, women are defined like anyone else. Women are defined by the historical situations that they find themselves within, specifically historical situations predicated on domination and oppression. And in existentialist philosophy, especially that of Beauvoir's, situation has a very specific meaning. The simplest way to explain it is that situations are the sort of context within which subjects are born into or subjects find themselves into. When we're brought into this world, it's not like we're like a tabula rasa or a blank slate. And as we proceed through society, we just take on these different aspects of our identity. When we come into the world, that's certainly the case in some senses, but we're also already defined by these social structures that straitjacket us into these identities or into these positions. And our degree of control over that varies depending on who you are, right? So, although women lack in essence in the traditional sense, that is in this Platonic or biological sense, it doesn't mean that women or the experience of women don't exist, because for Beauvoir, they exist in the sense that they exist within the situations that they find themselves in. And these situations define the experiences of women across the board. So as a reminder, remember, existentialism is a philosophy that's predicated on this idea that existence precedes essence. So we're not born into the world defined by this a priori essence. We're defined primarily by our existence. And Beauvoir agrees with this framework, but when you read Sartre, for example, Sartre maybe seems to overplay the degree to which humans or certain humans have freedom to define their essence and the degree of freedom that they have to make choices. Because in the case of women, the ways in which women can freely make decisions or freely define or redefine their essences is maybe not as available as it is for men, because women have to navigate all these social, cultural, political, legal constraints that men don't necessarily have to be subjected to, right? So because women are brought into this world defined by a situation predicated on ubiquitous male domination, existentialism has to be sensitive to those social structures, according to Beauvoir. So Beauvoir writes here, quote, in truth, to go for a walk with one eyes open is enough to demonstrate that humanity is divided into two classes of individuals whose clothes, faces, bodies, smiles, gaits, interests, and occupations are manifestly different. Perhaps these differences are superficial, perhaps they are destined to disappear. What is certain is that they do most obviously exist. So a good example to illustrate this is, with how society brings up children or cultivates gender norms within children at a young age. So, when girls are young, it's not that girls are inherently predisposed to want to play with dolls and like the color pink. And by that same token, boys aren't predisposed to want to play with, you know, uh, military action figures and like the color blue. The ways in which gender takes a form is the way in which society rewards or has these expectations that they impose on children. So when girls are cultivated and when girls are raised to, be exposed or be encouraged to play with dolls, that cultivates them to do reproductive tasks like cleaning or rearing children or sort of simulating the domestic sphere, right? Whereas for boys, with the example of like the military action figures, they're conditioned to be, workers. They're conditioned to go fight in wars if the need arises. They're conditioned to be strong and masculine and outside, being an outside and stuff like that. Um, but obviously, uh, uh, in those cases, the gender norms are defined by society, not defined by the so-called essence that each gender has. So for Beauvoir, she writes that, women are therefore defined by their alterity or their otherness. And in philosophy, and certainly in existentialist philosophy or in Hegelian philosophy, this concept of the other or an other has a very specific meaning. And the other is an ulterior subject whose identity is independent on the dominant identity. Um, it's a good way to illustrate this, or the way that Beauvoir illustrates this is, the concept of woman doesn't have an independent meaning or an autonomous meaning outside of the concept of man, right? Um, or by that same token, for philosophers of race like Frantz Fanon, who we didn't necessarily read in this course, he would write, the concept of black or blackness doesn't have an independent existence or an independent meaning aside from it not being white, right, or the absence of whiteness. Um, and Beauvoir uses a Hegelian philosophy, this idea of the master-slave dialectic, which we won't get into here. But what's also interesting about otherness is that, although the concept of man is taken up as neutral and pervasive and absolute, it also itself implicitly relies on the construction of womanhood, right? But because men are in a dominant position in society, have established patriarchies throughout the world, um, the reliance of the concept of man to the concept of woman is in some senses erased, right? Um, and Beauvoir writes, if you think about it, it's strange because in the history of Western philosophy, and certainly in all the philosophers that we've read in this course up until now, when philosophers talk about things like human nature, they always talk about human nature relative to men or male experience, right? And they just kind of ignore and brush off the experience of women, or they don't regard the experiences of women to be relevant to the study of human nature. But this is absurd because women, comprise about 50% of humanity. So if you want to write about human nature, but you're going to ignore 50% of the people that make up that humanity, then it's a strange situation. But Beauvoir writes this, and many have written this too. But patriarchy, or male domination of women, is probably the oldest form of hierarchy in human history, in various societies across the world, right? Um, and Beauvoir conceptualized patriarchy in terms of what she called reproductive slavery. So this idea that women are completely controlled by men, and they're controlled because women have this are forced to take on these reproductive positions in society. And think of reproduction not just in terms of child rearing and like raising children, but also doing work that just simply supports men or supports male society or supports patriarchy, right? So things like cleaning, things like domestic work, but things like sex work, all these things that are reproductive in nature. Um, but unlike productive labor, for example, reproductive labor is hardly, if ever, compensated by the society, right? Which is why Beauvoir likens it to a kind of slavery because, uh, in some senses, it's not optional. In some senses, it's not compensated, right? Um, and Beauvoir alludes to Claude Levi-Strauss, who is this anthropologist, among other things, during the 20th century, where he had this thesis that humans started to leave the state of nature and enter into civilization once women were transformed into property that could be owned and exchanged, right? So according to this framework, you become a civilization once you're able to control women and control the reproductive activities of women, and exchange them through marriages and all these sorts of things. Um, and so, despite the ubiquitous nature of women's subordination vis-a-vis patriarchy, women have struggled probably the most out of any oppressed group to understand themselves in a subjective sense or a subjective term. What that subjective here means is like women don't see their struggles as a struggle that concerns all women, right? According to Beauvoir at this time again. Um, so, if you contrast this with like racial minorities or the proletariat, Beauvoir wants to write that women haven't achieved this degree of solidarity compared to other oppressed groups. So, in the case of like Du Bois, for example, Black Americans have this understanding that they are Black, that there is this social solidarity among Black people who are in this common struggle. And certainly during Beauvoir's time, the working class, the proletariat, have this understanding that there's a social solidarity among workers who are struggling together to fight for a better world. But Beauvoir wants to suggest that women haven't maybe achieved that level of social solidarity to the same extent as these other groups. And this is because women are dispersed among differing racial, class, and national groups. So whether it's the Black community, whether it's whites, whether it's the working class, whether it's the capitalist class, whether it's the United States, whether it's France, Russia, China, whatever, right? Women are everywhere. Women are pervasive. But because women tend to be always within the sort of orbit of men, or within the sort of control of men, or the domestic sphere, even, it's a lot harder to build those ties of solidarity. Um, but for Beauvoir, what this book sets out to do is to find how that solidarity can come about.